So I have one, two, three, four, five books here, including this one. These are them that I'm really excited to read. I'm super excited about them actually. And I want to talk about them a little bit. So the first one is The Discovery of the Unconscious. I've posted about this on Instagram, and I want to talk about why I'm excited to read this. Like, on the one hand, it is like an exploration of the history of the unconscious and what this idea means. And in modern psychology, there's been a tendency to portray the unconscious as, let's say, negative or tyrannical, a little bit more animalistic, right? So like in evolutionary psychology, we tend to do studies that show that we're a lot more similar to animals than we once thought, where it's even going to be something like they asked university students if they thought about killing another person, and I think half of them said yes. Things like this, right? And these are the kind of thought processes that don't get consciously articulated because it's socially inappropriate, but they happen nonetheless. And so evolutionary psychology tends to insinuate that there is unconscious thinking that is a lot more animalistic, which is, you could say, negative, and generally speaking, not necessarily, but it's not rosy and like pink and romantic, right? Freudian psychology, obviously, very negative interpretation of the unconscious. Maybe Jungian psychology, not so much, but I'm not saying everything has been negative in modern psychology. Just generally speaking, the unconscious has been viewed as negative. And so by going through the history of the unconscious, like how people have talked about it, you can take like a step back and see how the previous thinkers have influenced the conversations going forward. And you can choose to maybe step out at a certain thinker. You can choose you can be more self-aware about where you step out of that conversation and decide to take it to a different direction. So for example, you could maybe come up with like a romantic, positive, optimistic notion of the unconscious. You could do that, and as long as it's evidence-based to an extent, obviously evidence doesn't prove the theories inside science, but it is helpful to have evidence-based theories. As long as it's to some extent based on evidence, you can do that. And I think reading about history will help you step out of the narrative that the unconscious is completely bad or tyrannical. And the other thing I like about this book is it is still, in addition to being a history of the unconscious, it's also a history of psychotherapy or psychiatry. And what I like about this is you can see how therapists have approached dealing with people's problems over time. For example, there's people who say that mental diseases are just brain diseases. And there are people who say that in order to do psychotherapy, you actually need to not approach it as a naturalist because it doesn't make... There's a disparity between the language of neuroscience and the language of subjective experience, and that disparity can't be bridged. There's just a unbridgeable gap there, and if you use the language of neuroscience, it's hard to make it make sense in terms of the subjective experiences. Some people disagree with that, but it is interesting to see how these people model like the irregularities of consciousness over time, right? This is an interesting thing to read about, and I'm really excited to read about that actually. Like for example, the people who reject that the idea that mental diseases are just brain diseases, or at least reject that you can diagnose mental diseases by simply diagnosing brain diseases, would have to norm their opinions about the irregularities of consciousness by massive amounts of interview data, right? Which is a pretty interesting thing to do, and I would imagine the rate of error for diagnosis or for accuracy is probably really high when doing that, but attempting it nonetheless still seems very fascinating. So that's this book, and it is a big book, but I'm really, really excited to read this book. It might be one of my most anticipated reads. Let's go to this one next. So this one, Shame and Necessity by Bernard Williams. I've had this book for a while, and I really want to read it. Again, I have my to-be-read list. It's just out of control. It's actually like a dysfunction at this point. So the reason why I want to read this book is because it talks about, shame. And the necessity, I think, is used in a few different ways inside this book. But my reading it is for the idea of shame. I think this is a really important idea, and I think I need to incorporate it more into my life, because I use the word guilt sometimes. Like, I do things and I might feel guilty about doing it, but I don't really think that there's things that I can say I have shame for. And it's probably because I have a tendency to relegate the notion of shame to like social shame, where it's like you're being shamed by other people. But I think if you can incorporate that idea of shame into your day-to-day life, it becomes a lot more powerful concept. And shame is a lot more of a vulgar word than guilt. Guilt almost seems like a child who ate one too many cookies and gets a little like, you shouldn't do that. Shame is like you've done something almost unforgivable. It seems like a really, really, really harsh word. And as a result, I want to now use this notion of shame in my life a little bit more routinely, especially because I come from a bias, like I grew up in the Western world, right? Canadian. I come from a bias where things should be liberated and shame should be almost self-shunned. Like the idea of if it's not harming anybody, it's okay to do. And that kind of thinking has proliferated every area of my life. Like if I don't know, if I choose to wake up and not work 6 hours in a day, it's not harming too many people. That should be okay to do, right? Arguably, it's harming nobody. That should be okay to do, right? And you shouldn't feel shame or guilt about that. That's fine. That's not morally wrong. But that's the kind of thinking that has proliferated. If you let that proliferate too much, then I think that actually has a detriment on your life. And I think I almost need to go against the years of cultural training that I've had to undo that kind of thinking in certain areas of my life, not across the board, because I do think it's an important moral principle. But I need to undo that thinking in some areas of my life and actually bring in the concept of shame. And I think I should learn how to feel a sense of shame for if, let's say, like I stated that I want to practice 300 hours of piano this year, okay? If I don't achieve that, maybe I should feel some shame, not just guilt, but like shame, right? Maybe having that stronger emotional association with it might be a better way of going about things. Now, I should also say that this book talks about shame as a kind of somewhat a control mechanism. And I do agree that shame actually is a bit of a control mechanism. And the same way that you could say, what is the slave master morality system that Nietzsche talks about? If I'm not mistaken, I believe it's something like poor people will say it's good to be humble because they're just rewarding themselves, and rich people will say it's good to live lavishly because life is short, and they're just adopting moralities that favor their own circumstances. And so in some sense, shame can be a way of controlling, it's a use of control, a means of control over your behaviors. And as long as I think you're self-aware about that, it's fine. As long as you're using shame in a way that you get outcomes that you want, then I think it's fine. So yes, shame can be to some extent a control mechanism, but I don't think that's too much of an issue. And this book does talk about that quite a little bit, especially in context with the Western world's thinking of you being free to do everything, right? Even things that aren't shameful by society standards. Maybe instead bring back some ideas of shame, even if society doesn't find it shameful, into your own life. So this book I'm really excited to read, and hopefully I can get to it this year. This next book is a Joseph Campbell, A Hero with a Thousand Faces. This is basically a placeholder book, to be honest. I do really want to read this book, but I want to read all of Joseph Campbell. I want to read The Power of Myth, Oriental Myth. I have all of the mythology series he has. I also want to read Eric Neumann. I want to get more into mythology because I read, is it Eric Hamilton? I think I don't remember, but it's like the Greek mythology book. I read that book and I really liked it. And what I really want to do is relate myths back to my life in a way that I can use them as narratives. So maybe like a great example is the hero myth. If I like to view myself when I'm achieving my goals or pursuing things as carrying a sword and a shield and going to slay a dragon or climb a mountain or overcome a great difficulty. And I try, and even when I'm working out, I try and keep the same mentality that I'm using when I'm working out for my day-to-day things, right? If I'm feeling sluggish, in the same way that I would hype myself up when I'm running a fast 5K or hitting a deadlift PR, I would use that same kind of internal dialogue, that same stimulating the nervous system by hyping yourself up. And I think when you can relate myths into your day-to-day narratives as well, it really helps. So if you can use the heroism myth, right, the valiant hero who fights insurmountable problems or challenges, if you can use that in your day-to-day life, you can kind of sample from the stories that you've been exposed to for so long as a source of motivation or as a source of contextualizing the challenge that you're facing. So I don't know, let's say if you're feeling really sluggish on a Monday, or let's say you're feeling sluggish on a Saturday and you're tempted to say I'll just give in and maybe, I already worked 4 hours. Maybe I won't hit the 5 or 6 hour marker. I'll give in. Well, you can relate that circumstance back to a story that you read where a hero was tempted with the reward, and that reward might have been very, it might have been something that hero might have actually wanted, but it's a reward and a temptation that came at a time right before the hero is about to achieve their goal, right? So if it's a Saturday, maybe you're trying to work 5 hours a day from Monday to Sunday, or maybe you take Sunday off, and you're just at that finish line and there's a temptation to give up. And so you can then say, well, that hero didn't give in. And you can now look at your own circumstances and say, hey, it's analogous here, right? If I'm going to be a hero, then in this case, I need to not give in. But not only like when it comes to overcoming challenges can you use these stories, but also when it is appropriate or inappropriate to use like this hero mythology, right? There are probably times where an excessive amount of heroism is not the way to go. Like for example, if you're at someone's funeral and everyone's sad, maybe telling them that they need to be like resilient and overcome their emotional weaknesses or something, right? It's probably not the time to do that. And again, you could then sample from like the stories that you've read when it's appropriate to be your hero and when it's inappropriate to be your hero. I think that kind of thinking in general is a really great way of contextualizing your life, like adding a set of semantics to your life. And for that reason, I'm really excited to read this book. I know also Irvin Yalom talks a lot about mythology. I think Peterson does too. This is just one of the many placeholder books for that kind of thinking. This next book is Language and Law, the Oxford Handbook. This is kind of a placeholder book too. What I really like about this book and just books that are like meant to be the placeholders for interpretation. Basically, I'm putting this book on here because I really want to read. I do, but there's another book I have that's on legal interpretation that I also really want to read. And the reason why I'm picking legal interpretation is because I think to some extent, your ability to interpret things determines the possibilities that you can perceive. So interpretation leads to representation, you could say. And if you want to have a wide range of representation, then you need a wide range of interpretive ability, right? Like if you can't interpret, the great example is like if you're doing chess puzzles, right? If you can't interpret the board correctly and calculate the moves correctly, then you're not going to see as many solutions as someone who could. And what law does is it can teach you how to take like a literal interpretation, right? Or an interpretation based off of the social context, or an interpretation that's based off intention, or you could even say like an interpretation that's based on the spirit of the law. And you'll get a lot of really, really highly nuanced conversations about these different types of interpretations and why they're applicable here, not applicable there, why they're better here versus not better here, right? Why they're bad faith or good faith, depending. But you get this really, really nuanced, difficult, long conversation about interpretation. Now, what I like to do usually when I study like a skill in one domain like this, like law, which is another reason why I'm excited about reading it, is then I bring it to another domain. So it's kind of like a conceptual metaphor. If you're familiar with cognitive linguistics, you sample one domain of experience onto another, in order to map another domain of experience, right? You're using your knowledge from this domain to map that domain or the new domain, right? And when you have this ability, these kind of categories of like literal interpretation versus intended interpretation versus like the spirit of what of what the legislation was trying to get at, you could bring that to other domains, such as like, let's say you're a psychoanalyst, right? Going back to the first book on this list. Let's say you're a psychoanalyst. You could, for example, take someone's words at their literal meaning and then think about the consequences of what it would mean if they intended the literal meaning. Or you could say like there was a spirit at which they were trying to get at, and you could choose to therefore ignore the literal meaning. But if you don't have a wide range of interpretive ability, right? If it's just to say, for example, you take everything that people say as literal, and you don't understand like social implication or whatever, then you could actually very well not only misinterpret people, but not have a wide enough range of representation to thoroughly understand where someone's coming from. And so because of reading books like this, like legal interpretation books, I'm going to be able to gain a greater understanding about interpretation and bring it into a new domain, which is why I'm really excited to read this book. This last book is The Affluent Society, This is a very popular book. And basically, the idea behind this book is to talk about your relationship to your productivity. So not just like, it's not necessarily against like affluence and spending on like very, very luxurious goods, but it does make you question, do you really want to work? Let's say like you only work 2 hours, and then as a result, you can have 6 hours of free time, but you can't buy fancy dinners at restaurants, you can't buy luxury cars, so on and so forth. Or you could work 6 hours and then you can get 2 hours buying luxury goods, right? It makes you think about the actual trade-offs, which I think is economics is about, and I believe he's an economist, right? It makes you think about the trade-offs between your productivity and your free time, and also how you spend your money, how you spend your dollars. So if you do want to be somebody who, it's again, I don't think the book is shaming you if you say like, oh, I want to work 8 hours and then buy luxury goods for 2 hours. And I don't think the book is saying that it's good that you only work 2 hours and take your 6 hours of free time, but it is saying we've reached a point in society where there is a superfluous amount of work, in the sense that it's above meeting your mandatory needs, like your basic needs, like food, shelter, medicine, education, these things. It is, a lot of people do have this ability to work beyond meeting those needs. And it's asking, is that even worthwhile? Like in the grand scheme of things, is that really what you want to have in your life? And I'm hoping when I read this, I'm hoping it's going to help me think about my relationship to these things, because I don't think I'm a super like big consumer, but I do think that there are things that I spend money on that I could have spent otherwise that would have made me happier than the thing I spent it on, right? Like maybe if I get really, really good at like piano, maybe 10 years from now, or whatever, if I can stay consistent and play for 10 years, maybe then I would be okay with buying like a $5,000 piano or something, right? But in the short term, like even right now, like I have a lot of unread books. Maybe instead of buying another unread book, or maybe I do like buying books. So maybe instead of buying 10 unread books, maybe I can think about buying maybe 5 unread books and then doing something else with the money that I could have spent on the books to make other people happy. Because I think giving money away, there was a study about this where money does buy happiness as long as you do pro-social things with your money. I think money doesn't buy happiness after like it was $120,000 a year or something. It no longer can buy you happiness if all you're buying is like goods and spending on yourself. But if you continue to give more money away, then yes, money can buy happiness. I believe that's what the research suggested. It's been a while since I read that research, so I want to think about that a little bit more. And that's why I'm really excited to read this book, because I think this book will have a huge impact on my financial outlook on life and just my life in general. So those are some of the books that I'm really, really excited to read. And I would be interested to see what kind of books you have. Some of you have recommended some pretty interesting books, actually, that I have bought. There's somebody who mentioned an author recently. There's this 2-volume of aesthetics that I really want. And he has another book called In the Defense of Purity, which I think is going to be super fun, because all the modern dogmas that I've heard has been against purity. And it's very rare that I hear someone defending purity. So that would be interesting. If you have any authors that you think have written really, really impactful books, I'd be interested to hear it there. And with that being said, bye-bye.